Midnight was approaching on May 14th, 1948. Inside a modest museum hall in Tel Aviv, a portrait of Theodor Herzl hung on the wall, flanked by two blue and white flags. The room was packed, suffocatingly hot, and completely silent, as a man with a shock of white hair stood up to speak. His name was David Ben-Gurion. In a steady voice, he read a document that would change the map of the Middle East forever. He was declaring the creation of the State of Israel. But outside that room, there was no time for celebration. The British Empire, which had ruled the land for 3 decades, was packing its bags and leaving at the stroke of midnight. And the moment the British ships sailed over the horizon, 5 organized Arab armies were preparing to cross the borders. The people in that museum hall knew that by the time the sun came up, they would be fighting for their very existence. This is the story of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. It is a story of a stunning, against-all-odds survival, a devastating tragedy, and a conflict whose echoes still shake the world today. To understand how this powder keg ignited, we have to rewind. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, 2 powerful movements were colliding in the same narrow strip of land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. On one side, Zionism, a movement born out of centuries of violent persecution in Europe, driven by the belief that the Jewish people needed to return to their ancestral homeland to survive. On the other side, a rising tide of Arab nationalism among the Palestinian population, who had lived on and cultivated that same land for centuries and desired their own independence. Then came the British. During the First World War, the British Empire made contradictory promises to both sides just to secure help in defeating the Ottoman Empire. They promised the Arabs an independent state, and simultaneously, through the Balfour Declaration of 1917, promised the Jewish people a national home in Palestine. When the war ended, the British simply took the territory for themselves under a League of Nations mandate. For 30 years, they tried to manage the unmanageable, caught in the crossfire of 2 increasingly desperate and militant groups. Following the unimaginable horrors of the Holocaust, global sympathy for a Jewish state surged, while violence in Palestine spiraled out of control. The British, exhausted and bankrupt from World War II, threw their hands up and handed the problem to the newly formed United Nations. In November 1947, the UN voted to partition the land into 2 states, one Jewish, one Arab, with Jerusalem governed by an international regime. The Jewish leadership accepted the plan. The Arab leadership, feeling they were being forced to give up over half their land to a minority population, completely rejected it. The very next day, a local civil war erupted. For 6 months, before a single foreign army invaded, the land was torn apart by brutal, localized fighting. Palestinian militias besieged the roads, cutting off the 100,000 Jewish residents of Jerusalem from food and water. Jewish paramilitary groups like the Haganah, Irgun, and Lehi launched fierce counter-offensives. It was a war of convoys, ambushes, and terror. Villages were attacked, civilians were killed, and panic spread. Entire Palestinian communities began to flee or were expelled from their homes, the beginning of a mass exodus that the Arab world would come to call the Nakba, or the catastrophe. This brings us back to that sweaty museum hall on May 14th, 1948. The British mandate officially expired. Israel declared independence, and the surrounding Arab nations, Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, launched a coordinated invasion to crush the new state in its infancy. On paper, it looked like a massacre waiting to happen. How could a newborn nation, with no official army, no air force, and a patchwork of militias armed with smuggled weapons, survive the combined might of 5 established militaries? This is the classic David versus Goliath narrative that became legendary. But the reality on the ground was far more complex. The Arab armies were deeply divided. They didn't have a unified command, and their leaders were often more suspicious of each other than they were of the Israelis. King Abdullah of Transjordan, for example, had the best trained fighting force in the region, the British-commanded Arab Legion. But his primary goal wasn't necessarily to destroy Israel. It was to capture the territory designated for the Palestinian state and add it to his own kingdom, putting him at odds with Egypt and Syria. Meanwhile, the Israelis were fighting with their backs to the sea. They had nowhere to retreat. While they started the war completely outgunned in artillery and heavy weaponry, they actually fielded more troops on the ground than the invading Arab armies. And David Ben-Gurion ruthlessly forced the various independent Jewish militias to merge into a single unified force, the Israel Defense Forces, or IDF. The fighting was ferocious. The bloodiest battles centered around Jerusalem and the strategic highway leading to it. The Arab Legion successfully captured the Old City, driving the Jewish residents out of the historic Jewish quarter. The Israelis launched desperate, repeatedly failing frontal assaults against the heavily fortified police fort at Latrun to break the siege of the city. But then came a moment of pure, desperate ingenuity. Realizing they couldn't take Latrun, the Israelis secretly carved a makeshift, hidden dirt road through the steep, treacherous mountains right under the noses of the Arab forces. They called it the Burma Road. Working under the cover of darkness, volunteers literally carried hundreds of tons of food, water, and weapons on their backs up the steep ravines until the road was passable for trucks. They broke the siege and saved Jewish Jerusalem. In June 1948, the United Nations finally managed to broker a 4-week ceasefire. This truce would decide the outcome of the entire war. The Arab armies used the time to rest, but they failed to bring in significant new weapons or troops. The Israelis, on the other hand, went into absolute overdrive. Utilizing a massive international smuggling operation, they defied a global arms embargo. They flew in thousands of rifles, machine guns, artillery pieces, and even disassembled fighter planes, mostly bought from Czechoslovakia. When the truce expired and fighting resumed, the military tide had completely turned. The IDF went on a massive offensive. They broke the Egyptian lines in the south, pushed back the Syrians in the north, and captured vast tracts of land in the Galilee and the Negev desert. The Arab armies, suffering from a lack of coordination and stretched supply lines, began to collapse. By early 1949, the Arab states realized the war was lost. One by one, they signed armistice agreements with Israel. The map drawn by the fighting looked nothing like the UN partition plan. Israel emerged from the war holding 78% of the territory of Mandatory Palestine, far more than it had been allocated. Transjordan occupied the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Egypt took military control of the Gaza Strip. But what about the Palestinian Arab state promised by the UN? It never came into existence. The human cost of the war was staggering. Israel lost around 6,000 lives. 1% of its entire population, a devastating blow for the new nation. But they had secured their independence, defended their borders, and created a sovereign haven for Jews fleeing persecution worldwide. For the Palestinians, the war was an apocalyptic shattering of their society. An estimated 700,000 Palestinians became refugees, ending up in sprawling camps in Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. Many expected to return to their homes when the fighting stopped, but Israel barred their return, and their abandoned villages were either destroyed or repopulated by Jewish immigrants. The 1948 war didn't solve the conflict. It merely froze it in place. The armistice lines were drawn with a green marker on a map, the famous Green Line, but they were never recognized as permanent international borders by the Arab states, who refused to acknowledge Israel's right to exist. The trauma, the displacement, and the unresolved borders created a deep, festering wound in the Middle East. The events of 1948 set the stage for the Six-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, and decades of violence and failed peace processes that continue to this very day. To understand the headlines you read this morning, you have to understand the choices, the battles, and the tragedies of 1948. It was the year a nation was born out of the ashes, and the year a people lost their homeland. And the world is still grappling with the shockwaves.